Hi, I'm Tom O'Connell with the Eastside Freedom Library. Welcome to the fourth in a series of conversations we are calling Learning from the Past, Fighting for the Future. Tonight, we are talking with John Nichols, National Affairs Correspondent for The Nation magazine, an associate editor of the Madison, Wisconsin Capital Times, and also contributor to The Progressive. He is the author of numerous books on social movements and progressive politics, including the most recent book, which we'll be discussing tonight, The Fight for the Soul of the Democratic Party, the Enduring Legacy of Henry Wallace's Anti-Fascist and Anti-Racist Politics. In writing about Henry Wallace, John Nichols introduces us to one of America's great progressives, but one I dare say few know much about. And if this were an online trivia contest, I wonder how many of our viewers could identify Wallace as America's vice president during Franklin Roosevelt's third term, which ran from 1941 through 44. The fact that Wallace was forced off the ticket in one of the great, in the Democratic Convention of 1944 in favor of Harry Truman sets up one of the great what ifs in American political history. What if Wallace, an outspoken critic of racism, unbridled corporate power, and a champion of a post-World War II era based on international solidarity and peace, what if he had ascended to the presidency after Franklin Roosevelt's death in 1945? An intriguing question, but Nichols' book is more than a history of what might have been, but an up-to-date exploration of the ongoing struggle for the soul of the Democratic Party. And that's a pretty relevant topic as we enter the home stretch of what has already been a long and fraught election contest. So thank you again and welcome, John Nichols.
It's an honor to be with you. Great pleasure, my friend.
Same here. Okay, so let's just talk with Wallace, the person, and a little bit about who he was.
Sure. Henry Wallace was a Midwesterner, and so Minnesotans will understand that, an upper Midwesterner, in fact. He was born on a very small farm in Iowa, in a little place called Orient Township, which was very distant from Des Moines, very distant from most of the action, if you will. But he was born at a time when we still had an incredible regard for the agrarian life and agrarian workers. And he came up in a family that was very, very active in farm politics. His father and grandfather have both been active. And his father edited an incredible publication called Wallace's Farmer.
Oh, that was his father who did that. Okay, great.
His father got it started. It started in the family, but Wallace's Farmer circulated throughout the Midwest, and it was incredibly valued as a practical resource with lots of information, but also as a very rational, sensible champion of farmers and of small towns and of rural America. And the Wallaces became so well associated with that identity that, for instance, his father served as Secretary of Agriculture in a Republican administration in the 20s. And when Henry Wallace took over Wallace's Farmer, he really did sort of master the communications methods of the moment. He did the print publication, but he was also very present in when broadcasting began to rise. He was present there. He contributed to other publications. He became well known. And when the Depression hit, which was incredibly devastating for urban workers, but also for rural people, and especially for farmers, he was incredibly outspoken. Now, he had been a Republican all his life. A liberal Republican, in fact, actually a progressive Republican associated with the tradition of Robert M. La Follette in Wisconsin, and a very anti-war Republican as well. And when the Depression hit, he broke with Hoover in a big way and began to talk about the need to follow a different route. Franklin Roosevelt recognized this, reached out to him, got Wallace's endorsement in 1932, and when Wallace became president, when they unlocked the door, or when they walked through the door of the White House in 1933, Wallace came with him. And Wallace came in as Secretary of Agriculture at a time when Secretary of Agriculture was a huge position, incredibly powerful position. And it is fair to say that under Henry Wallace, for the first 8 years of Roosevelt's presidency, the Department of Agriculture was the engine of the New Deal.
Really?
It was literally where so many critical programs were developed. So many of the key figures worked. And Wallace was deeply committed to not just doing the New Deal, but explaining it, arguing for it, championing it.
Mm-hmm.
And so in 1940, when Roosevelt wanted to move to the left and knew he needed to bring in someone who was at once committed to the New Deal principles, but also an internationalist, someone who recognized that there would have to be a fight against fascism, he brought Wallace in as vice president, kicked out the guy who was there, John Nance Garner.
Ah.
And Wallace and Roosevelt won a landslide victory in 1940. Wallace became a central part of the Roosevelt administration during the World War II. There were deep internal battles, and it was during that time that Wallace really became the champion for the ideal that while we were fighting fascism abroad, we also had to fight racism, sexism, xenophobia, classism at home. And that made him into a hero for progressives, a hero for radicals, but someone that the establishment in the party despised.
Yeah, okay. So I was struck by his clear speaking about an advocacy for anti-fascism, which of course probably makes some sense given Hitler and Mussolini and what was going on around the world, but also anti-racism, and also a pretty strong critique of abuse of corporate power, which Roosevelt kind of went back and forth on. So tell us a little bit about that. Let's start with anti-racism. What was that? What was the conversation there during the 1940s?
Well, it's important to understand that Wallace grew up in rural Iowa.
Yeah.
And yet, because his family was so involved in farming and agriculture issues, as a child, he came to know many African-American agrarian scientists and farmers and others. I wouldn't, try for, in any sense, to suggest that he was some sort of perfect figure. He wasn't, but he did have interaction and had regard for the genius of African-American farmers and scientists. And so that was a part of him going into public office, public positions. Then during World War II, he was very, very influenced by A. Philip Randolph, the leader of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and others who were arguing for something in that period, and I write about it in the book, called the Double V campaign. 2 victories. Victory against fascism in Europe, victory against racism at home. And Wallace thought that was genius. He was very sympathetic to it, as was Eleanor Roosevelt, and as were a number of other progressive figures, some progressive union leaders. And so Wallace began talking about that a lot. And he was blunt about the need to move beyond sort of the gentle language of saying, well, we want all Americans to do well, to the deeper language of saying that we must address racism here at home. We must address segregation, Jim Crow, the poll tax, lynching. And he talked about these things as a vice president of the United States. That was unprecedented. It was remarkable. What he did and the way that he did it was distinct. It made him many enemies within the administration, people who thought that he was going too far. And then at a critical point, when there were race riots in a number of American cities in 1943, and this is an important part of the storyline. It's important to understand that A. Philip Randolph, through movement pressure, got Roosevelt to integrate the defense industries. Because the defense industries were integrated, there was a sense of what the future might be, of what progress might look like. But there was also immense resistance to that. And this wasn't just in the South. This was in industrial cities all over the country. In Detroit, there was a horrible race riot in July of 1943. You had dozens of people killed, overwhelmingly African Americans, and I believe 17 of them killed by police officers. And so the incident got a good deal of national news. It was a great concern. And instead of decrying everybody involved, Wallace was very specific. He said, look, this is racism. There's racism in play here. He flew to Detroit. He spoke to a crowd of thousands of workers organized by the United Automobile Workers and other unions, CIO unions, that were sympathetic to the ideal. And he said in his speech then, an incredible speech, we are fighting against fascism in Europe, but we need to understand that fascism and the European authoritarians that we're fighting against try to separate people based on their race or their ethnicity, and they try to demonize certain groups of people for political purposes and for purposes of advancing their agenda. And we must recognize that people who do the same thing here in America are practicing, and these are his exact words, Americanized fascism. And when he said that, he was of course right. Yeah. But boy, did he! Then the storm began. The New York Times said he was dividing the war effort, and the media attacked him. The segregationists attacked him. All sorts of people did, but Wallace did not back off. He went deeper and deeper into that message.
One of the things you write quite a bit about is visionary language and visionary proclamations like the Four Freedoms and the Economic Bill of Rights. Can you talk a little bit about this and Wallace's role in promoting a compelling vision?
Wallace was a pamphleteer. He was like Tom Paine. It was said that he rarely had a thought that he didn't spin into a pamphlet. And I have to say that in writing this book, I've been working on it for a number of years. And several years ago, I was out in Massachusetts giving a speech at a college. And there was a guy there who's an antiquarian bookseller, Russell Friedman. And Russell I've known for a long time. He's a wonderful man. And he said, "What are you working on now?" I said, "I'm writing a book about Henry Wallace and the fight against racism and fascism." He said, "Oh, that's great, blah, blah, blah." About a couple of weeks later, I got a big box at my house. And Russell, who's this great antiquarian bookseller collector, had collected up all the Wallace pamphlets, and he had a lot of them. Wow. And he sent them to me. And it was, I can't even begin to tell you how many of them there were. When he was at the Department of Agriculture, he wrote a lot about farm issues, but he also always wrote about, this bigger concept of why we're doing these things. He always believed that you could and should explain to the American people what your vision was in a compelling way, and then to spell it out, to detail it. And so this idea of visionary language was something that Wallace thought about a lot. He fretted about it. He worried about it. He encouraged Roosevelt to engage in it. And one of the big things about him was that he always was interested in going to the limit of what you could say in the best possible way. He didn't want to have a careful politician's language. He wanted to go big. And so when he talked about coming out of World War II, he talked about, all these vets who were going to be coming home, all these new people that were going to need work. He talked about 60 million jobs, a massive post-World War II jobs program. They did stuff in the New Deal, but he was talking about after the war. And he said this was going to be critical, not just for jobs, but it was also critical for, dealing with all the other issues the country had to deal with, race, class, gender. And that was how he did it. And he got Roosevelt to do it quite often, which was impressive. Yeah. But the most critical one, if we circle back for a second to the issue of race, sure. I think Wallace's greatest speech was given in 1947 to a group of African-American fraternities in Oklahoma. He was the former vice president. He was a very, very well-regarded figure at that point, and controversial, but well-regarded by a lot of folks. And so, it could have just been a standard speech. He could have said things that got him his applause. But he started out by saying, look, I'm not going to just come here and tell you what you already know, that there's racism, that there is, Jim Crow segregation, things like that. I'm going to tell you why we have to fight harder. Not the African Americans have to fight harder, but why whites have to fight harder. And he said, and again, paraphrasing a little, but very close to what he said in that speech, in an American city in 1947 at that time, science tells us that a African-American young man born at the same time as a white young man will live 10 fewer years. And then he paused and he said, we fight for those 10 extra years. Yeah, wow. It's perfect.
And of course, that sounds so familiar now with the racial disparities around COVID and health. Wow. So let's talk a little bit about 1944. Wallace is this champion of this progressive vision. And with Roosevelt's blessing, at least most of the time. But then in 1944, there's a revolt among certain elements of the party. What happened there?
Sure. It's a very good question. And look, I think there's two critical pivot points in American history where a vice presidential selection could have gone one way or the other, and it went the wrong way. Okay. Look, there's plenty of bad vice presidents. I wrote a book about Dick Cheney, so
yeah, right.
comfortable with that concept.
Yeah.
But there's 2 points where presidents who had the potential to shape the future screwed up badly. First was Abraham Lincoln in 1864 when he got rid of Hannibal Hamlin, who was a very good vice president and a relatively visionary guy, and replaced him with Andrew Johnson, who was a Tennessee, border state sympathizer, frankly, with a lot of racist ideas, who was a drunk and a mess of a person, right? And they put Johnson in because they thought that would help him win the border states. It was a dumb calculation because Lincoln was actually going to end up winning the election by a pretty comfortable margin. But then Lincoln was assassinated and Andrew Johnson became the president in the post-Civil War era. So many disasters traced back to that. The second one, I would argue, was 1944. In 1944, Franklin Roosevelt was in the midst of World War II. He was a relatively young man, but he had had many health challenges and knew that his focus in the 1944 campaign was going to be on the war. It was going to be on the fundamental duties of the presidency. And so he ceded a lot of the responsibility for the re-election campaign to the Democratic National Committee, to the party insiders, frankly, to the bosses. And one of the things that he said was that the convention could choose the vice president. Now, he had forced Wallace's selection in 1940. That was very, very unpopular. And frankly, I think the truth is that Roosevelt feared if he forced a selection again, he might not be able to unite the party as effectively as he had in 1940. And, this is an audacious move to run for a fourth term as president in the midst of a war that many people were tired of and that was very, very frustrating, and frankly, with a lot of economic challenges at home. And Wallace said from the start, if you don't want me to run for vice president, you just tell me and I'll quit. I'll stop. I'll stand down, because that Wallace was a deeply loyal New Dealer and deeply loyal member of the administration, much more than other key figures. But Roosevelt said, no, I don't want you to stand down, but essentially you have to win it. It's on you. And then Roosevelt wrote a letter, a quite remarkable letter to the convention. And he said, he was not at the convention. He said, I am not a delegate to this convention, but if I was, because I've known him for so long, I would vote for Henry Wallace. So that was Roosevelt's statement.
Yeah.
However, Roosevelt also did maintain that if the convention chose someone else, he would accept that. And he was pressured by the chairman of the Democratic National Committee to say some names of people he would accept. He said William O. Douglas. He reportedly said William O. Douglas and Harry Truman. Again, under pressure, not particularly he didn't even know Truman, for instance, or at least didn't know him well. And so the convention came. And Wallace was not a conventional politician by any measure. He had strong union support. He had strong support from African Americans, Latinx, women, frankly, who were very impressed by his support for an Equal Rights Amendment. So he had a lot of the liberals and progressives. But remember, in those days, conventions weren't like they are today. And we have bad conventions now, but they were a lot worse. They were defined mainly by the bosses, by political insiders. The floor of the convention was, essentially a big smoke-filled room. And they came to that convention determined to get rid of Wallace. Now, Wallace, instead of organizing in a traditional way, said, I'd like to speak to the convention. The bosses literally blocked him from giving a major address, but they allowed him to second Roosevelt's nomination. Wallace came on the third day of the convention to do that seconded speech. And instead of being apologetic or concessionary or a classic politician, Wallace got up and he said, look, the only way that the Democratic Party is going to go forward as a party that is worthy of these times and that frankly can win in the ways that it must win is to go down the line for a liberal vision. And then he spelled it out. He said, getting rid of segregation, getting rid of the poll tax, getting rid of Jim Crow, respecting the role of women who had come into the factories to work, respecting the need to take on the powers of the elites and frankly, corporate power. He said it in very blunt terms. It was an aggressive, very short speech. The convention went wild. They loved it. Even the people who were there as, basically the allies of the bosses really liked hearing this message. It was a visionary, progressive, well-delivered, hopeful message that spoke to renewing the New Deal in the post-war era. And as the day went on, as they had the vote for president, there was a demonstration organized by Wallace backers on the floor saying, let's not just nominate Roosevelt today, let's go all in. Let's nominate Wallace as well. And the demonstration started going really wild. The hall, clearly the ancillary areas of the hall, those were where the non-delegates were, for instance, in the balconies and places like that, were packed with people who were very favorable to Wallace. Remember, he polled incredibly well. He was beloved by a lot of the base of the party, and these were people who were there. And so it looked like there was a chance that he might actually be renominated, that it might work. Claude Pepper, who was then the senator from Florida, a little guy, started wrestling his way toward the stage. The stage was raised up. There were steps to get to it. At the steps, bottom of the steps of the stage, there was a gate. And you could only get allowed in if the people manning the gate, womaning the gate, allowed you to go forward. And it happened that the folks who were there were members of the Brotherhood of Maintenance of the Way and other rail unions. And they loved Wallace because he was very pro-union. And so they let Claude Pepper through. And Pepper started fighting his way up the steps. There were literally thugs trying to push him back down. And, it was a wrestling, pushing, tense kind of moment. He got to about 5 feet from the steps. And the political boss from Pittsburgh, who was really big in trying to stop Wallace, ordered the chairman of the convention to shut it down, close the convention. Don't let Claude Pepper get there, because in interviews, Pepper said that he planned to say, let's do it. Let's not keep this ticket going. I move for vote by acclamation to maintain our winning ticket. Yeah. It would have prevailed without a question. Yeah. And the chair of the convention said, I can't shut it down. These people I can't control this. And the boss from Pittsburgh said, shut it down, and was screaming. And there were other people coming in and pressuring this chair. And the chair raised his gavel up and hit it and said, I hear a motion to adjourn. And the hall rocked with opposition. It was the loudest no you ever heard. And then he said, I hear a majority in support of adjournment. And he gavelled the convention out of session at 10:22 on that night in July of 1944. That next day, and I read the diaries, the letters of delegates who were there. The next day, when Wallace supporters returned to the convention hall in the afternoon, particularly people were sitting in the balconies, backers, not necessarily just delegates, or not necessarily the delegates, their tickets were no longer valid. Overnight, they had printed new tickets for people who had tickets to the convention. In addition, the delegations were rearranged. It is said that more ambassadorships and post office jobs were given out in the period of 24 hours than any time in American political history. There was open political bribery going on, open political pressure to get people to oppose Wallace. Still, on the first ballot on that last day of the convention, Wallace won. He prevailed. He got the most votes. But they had rules in those days that didn't allow the person with the most votes to prevail. You had to get above a certain majority. And so they kept voting. And with each ballot, the bosses peeled off a few more delegates. And at the end of the day, Wallace was defeated and Harry Truman became the nominee for vice president. And at that point, over that 24-hour period, I would argue, just as I would argue with as regards to 1864 choice on vice president, American history was rewritten.
What a powerful and theatrical story. That's just
it is.
It's great.
It's fun to write, my friend.
Yeah. So You write that initially Wallace, rather than being embittered and going home, campaigns for Roosevelt. Of course, Roosevelt dies, Truman becomes president. And then somewhere between that time and 48, Wallace decides to run for president on an independent campaign. And you're critical of that. That's the one place in the book it seems like you're critical. Okay. Talk a little bit about what was at stake in that campaign, and I think even more than the campaign itself, what were the competing visions about America in a post-World War II era?
That's the great question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because it's the question we haven't resolved to this day.
Yeah.
And so immediately after Roosevelt's death, Wallace remained in the administration. Roosevelt had set Wallace up as Secretary of Commerce. He wanted Wallace to be the guiding force in a host of economic issues and economic matters coming out of World War II. And so the plan was to go forward with a lot of what Wallace had talked about, a lot of what Roosevelt had talked about in the Economic Bill of Rights. When Truman came in, he immediately began to get rid of the New Dealers. And Truman was not some right-wing extremist. He wasn't one of the worst players or anything like that, but he was more a man of the mainstream of the party. And there was a real pressure in the party to jettison the visionaries, jettison the more ambitious of the New Dealers. And so to give you an example of this, when the funeral train came up from Georgia, passed through Washington, picked up members of the cabinet, Wallace wrote in his diary as they headed toward Hyde Park to bury Roosevelt, that with each passing mile, he could feel the New Deal slipping away. And there was so much truth in that. There were many New Dealers who were in Roosevelt's fourth term administration. Within a year, almost all of them had gone. The key figures who had been in the cabinet, like Francis Perkins and Harold Ickes. At the end of the day, Wallace was pretty much the last of them. And Wallace gave a speech in New York in 1947, in which he was very, very blunt about a post-war vision. And he said, look, we're going to have to operate in a world with people we don't agree with and with people that we don't like. What we have to understand is that it is possible to do two things. Number one, make America such a positive and good and strong place that it will influence the world by its example. And this was obviously related to addressing racism, addressing sexism, addressing the economic divides in the country. And then two, also that we had to look for ways through diplomacy and international aid to maintain the peace, not to get into a third world war or even a Cold War. This was a speech that Truman had not rejected. In fact, Wallace and Truman had consulted about it. But when Wallace gave it, because it was seen as being sympathetic to the Soviet Union, and in fact, it did say that we should find ways to cooperate, very bluntly. Wallace was attacked. The right-wingers in the party, and frankly, the right-wingers in the media, who had always been out for him, made it a huge issue. And Truman, who again had approved the speech initially, said, well, you went way too far, this is too much, and essentially forced Wallace out of the administration. That was the end of the New Deal in the Truman administration. And it was also, in many ways, the pivot point into not just more of a Cold War mentality, but also toward McCarthyism, what we came to know as McCarthyism, because it's important to understand that Truman and people around him, well, they never went as far as McCarthy, embraced many of the ideas of, looking for communists, looking for leftists, looking for people who were pushing too hard for civil rights, for women's rights, for economic justice. And you really did start to see this division develop within the Democratic Party and beyond it. Now, here's where it gets significant, because there were a group of people, including many longtime New Dealers, who desperately wanted Wallace. I remember Wallace, the immediate former vice president, a very well-known, very popular figure with a lot of platforms to speak on. He was editing the New Republic magazine. He was regularly appearing on radio and giving speeches where 10, 15, 20,000 people showed up. Very much like what you might have seen, with Bernie Sanders in 2016 and 2020, just huge events anywhere he went in the country. And so there were people in the Democratic Party who desperately wanted Wallace to challenge Truman for the nomination in 1948. There was a group called Democrats for Wallace that was led by the former Attorney General of California. And there were many other active people within it who had been members of the Roosevelt administration. At the same time, though, Wallace became increasingly convinced that it was not going to be possible to win the Democratic nomination. He was undoubtedly right about that because the bosses were still very powerful. And so he determined to run a third-party campaign. Unfortunately, sadly, and I'd say this as an advocate for multi-party politics, what he ran into was all of the power of our political parties and of our media to demonize and diminish third-party candidates. And so the 1948 campaign, while visionary in so many ways, including Wallace's determination to campaign in the segregated South and to always have integrated rallies, to literally challenge segregation directly with his campaign, to such an extent that his vice presidential candidate, Glenn Taylor, was actually arrested by Bull Connor down in Alabama.
Bull Connor.
For literally going into it. Bull Connor was in charge down there and arrested Glenn Taylor for trying to, go through a door that was marked blacks only or whatever term they had on it. And so they really tried to do some wonderful things. They campaigned with, Pete Seeger and, with the sympathy of Woody Guthrie, with Paul Robeson and a young Harry Belafonte and so many other folks who believed in it. And yet the campaign crashed and burned. There was simply no question. Wallace accepted the support of the American Communist Party. That was highly controversial. Wallace was not a communist. In fact, he was a very successful businessman and entrepreneur, but he believed that you shouldn't demonize people because of their political views. Truman attacked on that. The media attacked on that. The campaign had many instances where Wallace rallies were literally interrupted and attacked by, especially in the South, by segregationists and thugs. When it came time for Election Day, the fear that Wallace might take enough votes to prevent Truman from being reelected, Truman being a better candidate, at least in some ways, than Thomas Dewey, the Republican, Wallace got really a very small vote. He a couple percent, but it wasn't sufficient to make a real dent. And it was primarily, it came out of New York, LA, the cigar makers in Tampa, Florida, where he won some precincts. And intriguingly enough, he got a much better percentage of the vote than might be expected in North Dakota, because there was a lot of radical farm activists who were his fans. But it was not a win. Yeah.
And it was here in Minnesota, of course, which had the Farmer Labor Party, had just merged with the Democrats 4 years earlier.
Oh, I write about it in the book. There was a brutal battle there. Yeah.
That was essentially a number of the farmer laborites who had supported Wallace and the progressives were pretty much
Floyd Olson.
Yeah.
And post Floyd Olson,
he was gone by then.
He was passed, but he had been very close to Wallace when Wallace was Secretary of Agriculture, and then Benson.
That's what I was thinking of. Yeah.
And he was a big Wallace backer in '48.
Yeah.
As a banker.
Yeah. Amazing story. Well, in the much of the almost.
Oh, can I give you one more thing before you ask your next good question? One more thing on that 48 campaign. Two groups left the Democratic Party in 48. One group was Wallace and the left. The other group was Strom Thurmond and the segregationists. By 1952, Strom Thurmond and the segregationists were welcomed back in. In fact, the 1952 Democratic ticket had a segregationist as its number two candidate, the vice presidential candidate, Sparkman out of Alabama, and a guy who had actually actively opposed the Democratic Party in 1948. But the Wallace and the progressives were not invited back in. In fact, they were really pushed to the margins of our politics. And so it's a very important part of the story is that the punishment for right-wingers and segregationists leaving was that they were welcomed back and got the vice presidential place on the ticket. The punishment for progressives and people who advocated against segregation and against racism was to be marginalized.
Yeah, that's an important point. So in the second half of the book, you really kind of take the history through up to the day. And you write about a number of presidential races and a series of more progressive populist challenges that always came up short. And finish.
Although I might say that Lyndon Johnson didn't do that badly.
Yeah.
And it's fair in '64 that Johnson was in some ways trying to renew the New Deal.
Right, exactly.
But you're right about most of them.
Right, yeah. And Johnson was, of course, kind of personification of the New Deal as well. So you finish with conversations with O.C. And Bernie. Where do you see that sort of contest within the party now, given Joe Biden and Kamala?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and it's exactly the question. It's why I wrote the book.
Okay.
I hope I wrote a timeless book, and I hope I wrote a book that will be of relevance going forward. But when I chose the title, "The Fight for the Soul of the Democratic Party," I knew that that fight was not settled, that there is basically an 80-year battle that's been going on since the times of Franklin Roosevelt and Henry Wallace over a simple question, and that is whether the Democratic Party will be a bold alternative to the right, and whether it will clearly and aggressively challenge authoritarianism, threats to civil rights and civil liberties, whether it will stand for economic and social and racial justice, and for a planning of the economy that takes care of those with the least economically, not just those with the most, and also that preserves the planet. These are all issues and values that Henry Wallace espoused and that others have along the way. The fact is, as I recount in the book, again and again, when people try to renew this bold vision, and the key is not just the policies, but it's the boldness of it, the determination that the Democrats would fill the void in American politics so that right-wing populism would not fill the void in American politics, so that you wouldn't have a Donald Trump. Again and again, when progressives tried to do this, they were undermined. They were marginalized. They were pushed to the sides. George McGovern in 1972 won the Democratic nomination. And then immediately, as I write about in the book, many of the leading figures in the Democratic Party leadership and establishment formed Democrats for Nixon. They actually campaigned against their own party's nominee in favor of Richard Nixon and Spiro Agnew because they didn't want the Democratic Party to actually stand for something bold and progressive. And Jesse Jackson ran into much the same experience in '84 and '88. And I recount again and again people who really did achieve things. Ron Dellums, Bella Abzug, Elizabeth Holtzman, who beat incumbent Democrats as progressives, but never kind of were allowed to get to that next stage. Paul Wellstone from Minnesota, who battled these forces with his great good spirit, but still had to battle them. The fight goes on. So I do close the book going with Bernie Sanders to Orion, Iowa. And we actually went to the farmhouse where Henry Wallace was born. And upstairs in that farmhouse, we spent a long time talking about this fight, this battle. And Sanders is there explaining the absolute necessity to renew a commitment to Roosevelt's economic Bill of Rights, and also to that vision that you have to go beyond just economic rights, that you have to address racism, that you have to address structural flaws, structural damage in our organization of our society and of our governance. And he's a part of it. And I wanted to touch on that part of Wallace's experience, that where he came from, out of the rural Midwest. But then I closed the book actually in Detroit, where, as we spoke earlier, the race riots of 1943 caused Wallace to feel he had a need to speak up. He had a need to speak up in a much bolder and more ambitious sense. And so as I was finishing the book and late in the stages of writing the book, I went to Detroit with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and she was campaigning there for some progressive candidates. And late at night, very late at night, we finally found some time to have a conversation. We did it in a Arab American neighborhood, not far from some of the big auto plants, or what were the big auto plants. And very close to where Henry Wallace had given that speech in 1943 about Americanized fascism. And at one point, toward the end of it, AOC showed, I think, well, in many ways, she's such a visionary politician, or political figure. She said, she talked about the New Deal, and she talked about, elements of it. But she said, what I really want to get back to is that sense that if there's a problem, if there's a challenge in society, we will take it on, we will address it, and we will resolve it. We will do our very best to. And then she paused and she said, I want to be that party again.
Yeah.
And I close with that one.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very inspirational way to close it. Well, John Nichols, thanks so much. We're going to have to leave it there. Really want to recommend your book, The Fight for the Soul of the Democratic Party, and your Nation columns, which offer wonderful comments. So I have one kind of final question, 30 seconds or a minute,
Sure.
that we've asked everybody. 2020 is a year of crisis and a year of social movements. As you look forward, what do you see as hopeful? What do we look back to say this development really was a hopeful development for us?
What a superb question, because we always should end with hope. And as Rebecca Solnit says, hope is very different from optimism.
Mm-hmm.
No, it's hope is what we have faith in and what we believe in and what we want to see. My hope is, as it has been frankly for a long time, I guess as you get to a certain age, it's in the young people who are not accepting the lies of the past. They are not accepting the happy talk and the easy ways out. And they're still in the streets in cities across this country, demanding racial justice, demanding a genuine response to systemic racism. And frankly, also to all of the people who have stepped up with a visionary response to economic injustice in this country and said, coming out of COVID, coming out of mass unemployment, we just have to do bigger and bolder things. We now have a discussion in this country about a universal basic income, about single-payer Medicare for all healthcare, about a Green New Deal. These things are real, and they're far advanced from where they were. And so I am exceptionally hopeful, but it is not a naive hope. It is a hope rooted in an understanding that again and again, we have had visionaries and they have been marginalized. And so perhaps my greatest hope is in the people who are determined not to be pushed back this time, who know that if the Democrats win in 2020, that the fight doesn't end. In fact, in many ways, the fight begins to make sure that the Democratic Party actually is a party committed to economic and social and racial justice.
Thank you so much, John Nichols, for taking the time to join us, for your book, for your writing, your continued advocacy. It was great to have you as our neighbor in Wisconsin.
I'm honored, and I will no Minnesota jokes today.
Okay, that's great.